Welcome to Ready Set Exec, the podcast where we sit down with executives across North America to unpack their business, leadership, and expertise.
And every other week, join us for Market Watch, all things hiring, real insights, and no fluff. Hi, everyone. I'm here with Liz Weber, leadership advisor to boards, owners, and C-suite teams. She's a strategic and succession planning consultant, keynote speaker, and author. Liz helps her clients focus on the right things at the right time to get the right impact. And as a result, they enhance performance, profits, and workplace cultures. Thanks for coming aboard, Liz.
Thank you, John. I'm happy to be with you today.
So we were a little bit touching on, business ethics, which, is a pretty hot topic lately in terms of, planning the ethics and the values of your business. And I kind of put values and ethics almost hand in hand because they're basically a decision-making tree or things that you want to think about when you're running your business or, making decisions that impact people. And you were chair of the IMC USA Ethics Committee, right? So obviously ethics is something you're really well versed in. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what does the right thing look like when the right thing isn't always clear? Like, how do you establish ethics for your business?
Well, as the ethics committee chair for the Institute of Management Consultants in the US, we have a code of ethics for that institute and for members of that institute. And it lays out basically 15 different principles that fall across the spectrum of how we interact with our clients, how we deal about our fiscal and financial responsibilities, and our commitment to the public and to the profession. And those different principles can include things as somewhat basic, John, as in working with our clients, we will ensure that the scope of our services are clear before we start so that clients are not surprised by our billing. Clients are not surprised when we push back and say, I understand what you're asking, John, but that's outside the scope of what we've agreed to. So before we move forward, let's just get clear that this is going to be in addition to what we've already covered. And something as seemingly basic as that for those of us who deal with contracted work on a regular basis is pretty straightforward. But for many individuals in the professional world, setting up those boundaries, not to restrict work, but to clarify expectations of your client and for you and for your team actually makes life a lot easier and elevates relationships instead of hurting relationships. Because, many of us, and I can speak for my husband on this one, he's a civil engineer and for years he was the individual when he worked with a large engineering firm that would have to go and help with collections from other division directors because they had not told their clients about changes. And then rightly so, the clients would get upset when change orders came in that were quite expensive. And so just clarifying boundaries up front makes life a lot easier. So to your question about ethics, a lot of times there is no one list of the right things or the wrong things to do. It's a matter of judgment quite often, but it's also a matter of what are either your company or your individual guiding principles, your values, or what you believe are the right things to do. And I'll go with the old tests that I throw out that we've heard about for decades and decades. The adage used to be, are you willing to do this and have it be shown on either, olden days, the front page of the newspaper, or now splashed across social media for your mother and your children and your grandparents and everyone that you love dearly to see? And would you be happy with them seeing this as a good reflection of who you are as a person? If not, you probably don't want to do it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, some people have no shame though, right?
And unfortunately, some people have no shame. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like that's under the assumption you'd be ashamed of that or you would care of the opinions of everybody. And
Right. And so, John, for that exact reason, that's why when I work with my clients on strategic planning, one of the first pieces of their plan that we either put in place if it's not in place already, or we refine it as part of their cultural framework are their organization's values or the organization's guiding principles, possibly both. Because when I work with my clients, the values are the house rules. And that means as long as you're taking a paycheck from my organization or you're representing my organization, let's say you're in a volunteer capacity. This is an association, you're a volunteer. When you are representing my company, paid or unpaid, by default, you abide by my company values. And those are behaviors that are expected of everybody. If you don't like those, then that's fine. Then you choose to support some other organization.
Yeah.
It's like my house rules. If you come to my house, we don't smoke. So you can't come to my house and light up in my house because I'm going to say, not allowed here. If you want to smoke, go outside or leave. My rules, my house.
Yeah, I guess devil's advocate to that is, I like to think of ethics also as like when people aren't looking, because, we're talking about things that are public or visible,
Hmm.
and a lot of times the true test of character and true test of people is like when there's not scrutiny, when there's not that
Hmm.
accountability, when there's not that oversight to catch people doing things that are not according to the house rules, right? So for
Hmm.
example, when someone comes to your house and lights a cigarette in front of you, there's someone to enforce those rules. You're there, you're like, hey, don't
Hmm.
smoke in my house. But
Hmm.
you had left the house, let's say you let me borrow and rent your home for the weekend. When you're not there, I go into the basement and I smoked in the basement, but I left the window open. I said, oh, she's not going to detect it,
Hmm.
so I'm just going to do it. So do you see what I mean? Where
Yep.
ethics without accountability, oversight, and so on, I mean, that's when people show their character. And a lot of times when we see that in business, people will, like companies will get away with what they can get away with when there's not that oversight. So SEC, for example, if they're not on top of people and they don't have the enforcement as much as they should, they don't have
Hmm.
the let's say the people to be able to go and check every transaction and all that. There's a lot of shady stuff going on all the time, and I think that's where people are kind of getting sick of all the corruption they're seeing with certain agencies and in business in general, right? Where there's a lot of
Absolutely.
this stuff going on. So how do you uh, how do you approach building ethics and not just having the ethics statement or the value statement be just a plaque on the wall?
Hmm.
What do you recommend about that?
Well, I really like the analogy that you use and saying, what about ethics when people aren't looking? And I don't mean to be patronizing when I say this, but I think the members of your audience who are HR professionals will understand why I'm saying this.
Hmm.
When my girls were little, um, we had a rule in the house that they shared a bathroom, and every Saturday they had to clean the bathroom before they could go and play with their friends. And I still remember this one particular Saturday, my oldest daughter, it was her turn to clean the bathroom, and she was gone maybe 7.5 minutes, and she came back downstairs, and she said, "I'm done." And I looked at her, and I was like, "Really?" And she goes, "Yeah, I cleaned the bathroom." And I said, "Okay, I'm
Yeah.
just gonna ask one question, and then I'm gonna go upstairs and check if the answer to my question is absolutely." And my question is this: is the bathroom clean to your standards, or is the bathroom clean to my standards? And she went and turned around and went upstairs.
Yeah.
And I share that analogy because now let's take it to the professional world, the adult world. And your comment, John, was, so what do you do when you've got values and ethics and all this kind of stuff? How do you make it real? This is where a leader, a manager, number one, they themselves need to appreciate how you use the values as a management tool, how you use your ethical standards as a management tool. I do a whole training program. We do a whole bunch of this when we're doing coaching with clients is managers need to get comfortable realizing that when you hold people accountable, it's the nicest thing you can do for them. And when you do it quickly, it's the nicest thing you can do for them. By that, I mean, if I'm your manager, John, and I start seeing you demonstrate a behavior where you're really rude to one of our team members and one of your coworkers, and that is so in violation of our values that I immediately ask to have a conversation with you. And I just simply say, "Hey, John, the way I saw you interacting there with Rico, and the way you spoke to him, do you think that's in line with our values? And you're going to say yes, no, or ooh. And I can immediately say, well, John, the language you were using and the tone of your voice and how you encroached on his physical space, that is disrespectful. And that's out of line with our values. And as long as you're part of this organization by default, remember you're bound to abide by these values. And right away in your head, you're going, my God, she really takes these things seriously.
Yeah.
A behavior like that starts reinforcing to adults who work with us that I believe in these and I'm going to hold you accountable to them because that's part of my job as a manager.
Yeah.
And so that also starts setting a pattern when I'm not around. And if I come back from a vacation, I expect the culture of my team to be the same when I come back as it was when I left. I don't want just because I'm on vacation for a week, all of a sudden you and everybody else starts treating each other terribly. And so that consistency in how we reinforce values, we talk about expectations and expected behaviors to the adults that we're working with, honestly is no different than what we were supposed to be doing when we were raising our children and that accountability factor.
Yeah.
And so when in my case, when my daughter, I just looked at her and I said, clean to your standards or my standards. And she's like, in the adult world, it's coming back and saying, John, did you speak to Rico appropriately or inappropriately? And if you know me well enough, because we work together enough, you go, I screwed up, Liz. I'm sorry. Get fine. Okay.
Yeah.
Just
So,
be attentive going forward.
accountability starts at the top and culture building as well, I guess, right? If people know they can
Yeah.
get away with it, if there's not that leading by example, for sure,
Hmm.
can agree on that. And so I guess working with leaders to make sure that they're living the values that they espouse. I think that's where sometimes people can fall short, maybe occasionally, often, right?
Often. Yeah.
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 But besides that, what other mechanisms of accountability must there be? Because you know, people are human; they're going to make mistakes and so on. And how do you? And this is the thing: is you know, every organization seems to have their different values that they espouse and whatnot. But in terms of business ethics, like, is there a universal business ethics we can agree on? Do you think, or is that something that's in flux, like cultural values and the country you're in and so on? Because it seems like there's a lot of different mindset to this.
Well, there are cultural nuances that are different. What
Yeah.
is acceptable in one culture is not acceptable in another. But I think going into that is again somewhat what I alluded to earlier is there needs to be an understanding between the parties involved as to what what is the agreed upon outcome we're looking for and how do we expect to work together to enable us to achieve that outcome. And I know that sounds pretty big and pretty broad, but that fundamental framework can vary by culture, can vary by organization, but then it's a matter of creating a relationship with whoever your counterparts are in, other organizations to get an understanding of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in those environments. Uh, and I think, you and I and probably all your listeners, we've all had experiences in our careers where working with some people, it's just easy. It's really easy, and because of that, it's fun. And in other situations, we're working with individuals who you scratch your head and you wonder why why is this so hard? What did I say in that last meeting or that last phone call that they completely misinterpreted and went off into left field? And did things that I don't approve of or I don't want to be involved with.
Yeah.
And in those types of situations, I guess getting back to your question about ethics, it's a matter of how quickly and diplomatically do you speak up and say, I need to tap the brakes on this for a bit because I need some clarity as to why you're doing A, B, and J. When the last time we had our conversation, we were talking about you doing X, Y, and Z. Help me understand where the shift occurred. And I think to your question, the whole idea about ethics is the willingness to to step up or speak up when you start getting a sense that something is going off track. And you want to make sure that there is clarity and alignment between where you believe things were supposed to be headed versus where they are potentially going to go.
No, that makes sense. Um, and when we're looking at, from a corporate governance standpoint, I think this is where ESG has come into play, and in terms of like values and how you want to be socially responsible. That's come into play, like I'd say, fairly recently, right? How do you balance, social responsibility and profitability at the same time? Because there's the fiduciary responsibility that the board has, right, to the shareholders and so on. But then you're adding this new nuance of social responsibility in there, ESG scores and environmental issues and so on. That to me seems almost counterintuitive because it's directly, I mean, if we're being honest, a lot of the ESG stuff goes directly against profitability in some cases, right?
Hmm.
I mean, being carbon neutral is a major cost to businesses to do that. There's remediation of carbon and all sorts of things you got to do to do that. You got to pay for those carbon credits or whatever, new technologies and so on. It's not always a benefit, right? Like you can say, okay, we switched to solar and we have our own power source now, and maybe that's going to pay itself off. But a lot of the things that we're doing in ESG sometimes can be an expense. It's never, I wouldn't say it's perfect, not yet, anyways. So, how do you balance that when you're looking at, we have these legal obligations, but then we're trying to bring in ESG into the firm. We're trying to show, corporate responsibility, right? And from what I've seen in a lot of cases, it seems to be they're more worried about the ESG score more of because it can affect their funding from major investors and things like that, rather than it being oh, we really need to do this because it may affect profits, it may affect their, like, and almost cynically it becomes you know uh, a PR kind of exercise in some cases rather than actually achieving something. So a roundabout way of saying how do you manage this in a business, because it seems to be very difficult to figure out.
Well, it's a really interesting question because given the times we're in right now, the whole ESG focus is somewhat in limbo. Um, around 2020, ESG was a very hot topic, and it was really forefront of a number of initiatives, just given supply chain issues and everything else. But ESG, from a societal perspective, was really hot. The last couple of years, it has fallen from grace in a number of situations. And to your point, and you're dead on with this is where, if an organization has a board or the ownership team, in the past, 5 years ago, it was a must do for society approval, for a lot of funding approval, for things like that. In the limbo land that we're in right now, John, this is where your question is really important because this is now forcing boards and leadership teams and ownership teams to sit down and say, so what do we really believe in? Do
Yeah.
we really do we really believe in this stuff? And are we willing to take a hit potentially financially or politically or societally by either jumping on board or backing away from this? And so the whole idea is one that is grounded in number one, their belief system, and number two, how are they willing to make choices that can impact their bottom line, impact their business strategy going forward by either continuing to pursue or not pursue ESG strategies. And it's one where, I don't have that many clients that are really strong, have real strong policies either way, because the work that they're doing is not terribly environmentally impactful, but they have still can take they still have taken a stance on a number of the commitments and positions that they make on a societal level and what they are willing and not afraid to share from a governance perspective. So all that being said is it's a It's a challenging time more so now for a lot of boards and owners and leadership teams to decide what are their value sets because it's not driven by regulation as much anymore and it's not driven by societal demand right now.
Yeah, and I get sort of the changing tides. Obviously, politically, there's a big pendulum that's going left to right, and everything seems to be very extreme on either side in terms of
Mhm.
how the approach is. And I think that's also been the norm, though. We think it's a recent thing, but I think politically, like you look back hundreds of years, like there's always sort of that shift left to right, that pendulum that swings of social change and so on. So
Mhm.
we saw it in the 60s, right? And so on. So it's just another season, I guess, for that. But I guess that's where you have people also talking about, and not to bring religion directly into this, but to say people they bring their personal values to work, and many times religious people will bring their religion or their foundational values that they got from religion to work, and then
Mhm.
say, okay, I have these values from home, from being a Christian, for example, and bringing them to my workplace, and that's how I like to run my business as well, from those foundational values, because that's how you've been raised.
Mhm.
And then how do you square that circle where you have your personal values versus, and I remember hearing this from people where they say, well, I don't bring my religion to my workplace, or I don't bring my values to my workplace. But what I'm seeing quite often now in the executive side of things is people bringing either their political values to work and running their business from a political spectrum, where
Mhm.
it's like almost a new thing now, where there's actually like political affiliation litmus test for employees, where you have to
Mhm.
agree with our political stance, left or right. There's no,
Mhm.
you know, this seems to be on both ends of the spectrum, really, from what I've seen from companies we've talked to. And then also same thing with religion, where they bring their religion to work, and they're, they like to have those values sort of be part of the foundation of the business. And I guess, hey, if it's your business, nothing wrong with that. It's, you're the one running it, but how does that create problems for, you know, hiring talent and so on? What do you think, as far as, is that a good way of running things, or is this just creating
Well,
problems?
it goes back to what I said earlier, and for that exact reason, John, is why when I'm working with a client, right away I need to find out what are the company values. And if the company values are, we're Christian based or we're Muslim based or we're agnostic, religion doesn't play into it. Whatever it is, fine. It's your company. It's not a publicly traded company, obviously. It's a privately held company. So it's your company. Okay, fine. It's in many ways, and I don't mean to sound denigrating when I say this, but it's why, again, when I work with clients, foundationally, we look at vision, mission, values. What are you trying to achieve? Why do you exist? And what do you believe in and how you're going to treat each other? Because the example I use when I'm working with my clients in mission statements is one of my clients I had years ago was a manufacturing facility. They manufactured these dump trailers that you could pull behind trucks and they, dump rock or whatever. And the thing was their mission statement, I don't remember verbatim, but basically said, we build dump trailers that help Americans do what they want to do or something like that. And, you know, when we first started sharing that mission statement, people were like, well, that's not very inspiring. And we said, it's not intended to be. It's intended to be a very clear, one sentence, very concise statement of what this company is and why they exist. Because if, John, you're looking for a job, but you don't want to work in a manufacturing facility, don't apply there. That's a manufacturing facility. That's what they do.
Yeah.
Make a choice. So it's no different than if you have a company that you drive by and you can see flags that they're flying and it shows political affiliation or whatever. If you don't agree with that affiliation, don't apply there. It's your choice, if you're looking for a job. And so it's a unique situation. I've been in business 33 years and some of these political divides or religious divides have never been an issue in hiring or the business world or in mission statements before, but they are right now. And as a sign of the times, that's why when I'm working with my clients, it's be clear in the type of company culture you are wanting to create so that anyone who works with you or wants to come here and work or is thinking about coming here and working with you has a clear idea of what they're getting into. And if they agree with that and they want to be a part of that and they want to help you succeed in that, wonderful. Then create that culture. Don't claim to be, neutral in whatever your beliefs are, and then hire people and then put your personal beliefs onto them and then try to have them adapt to that. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's right.
I guess transparency is key because, as you said, you need to know what you're getting into, right? But
Mhm.
how far should a company go though in supporting like social causes beyond its core business? Like this is a very slippery slope we've seen with some major. I give perfect examples that I've seen this happen to recently. You saw Bud Light with their campaign that was their customers didn't like that. It
Mhm.
was viewed as political in a little bit in the sense because it's obviously a hot topic with what was going on.
Right.
We saw this with Disney as well with certain things they were doing, either supporting social causes directly or appearing to have some kind of a agenda with their movies and so on. There was a big
Mhm.
backlash and so on, right? So are you advising like clients, let's say, stay out of it? It's just it's you're going to get burned from, if not from the one side, from the other side. You can't make everybody happy, right, in business. And if you're starting to take social stances on things, then you're getting to the arena, and the arena's not pretty, right? It's
Mhm.
pretty to be in that social arena right now because things are very heated, as everybody knows. I mean, it's wild on social media, right? You say something,
Mhm.
people are all over you. So what are you advising to people in terms of being political, being part of social causes, with the core, beside the core business? What do you recommend to them to do that?
So again, another interesting question because 10 years ago, 8 years ago,
Yeah.
it wasn't an issue.
Yeah.
And then it started being an issue. And I at the time was advising my clients, don't pick a side. This is have the company be neutral ground and let people come here and focus on what are the company values. And when we're here, what do we talk about? But that utopian idea doesn't work when the company owner is the one who is, or leadership team are the ones that are vocal, are the ones that have very strong opinions, and are the ones that obviously shape policy and shape culture. And so where I am in now, and I will be fully candid, I don't have any clients right now that have created either a religious or political or whatever slanted culture that impacts their employee population. But what I am seeing through my clients and what I'm hearing from my clients is when you own the company, when you're calling the shots, again, it's your company. So if you want to make a stance because it's something that you so firmly believe in that you want it to be a part of your business and a part of your company, then realize that some people are going to be attracted to that and other people are not going to be attracted to that.
Yeah.
That's
There's
fine, it's your choice.
consequences for everything,
There's
right?
consequences. Yeah, and there might be some sharper consequences, and there might be some sharper pushback and some sharper commentary by people than what you would have with your business if you didn't so overtly express your views. But if it's your company, it's your choice. And just be aware that like with any choice we make, there's going to be consequences. But,
How do you
you're
view
the
that
owner, you're the leader.
for a publicly traded company though? How would you view that though? Because that's a little different, right? In terms of responsibility. If your CEO takes a stance and you know that affects sales or affects the business in a very radical way, would they be liable for their statements because it's a publicly traded company? And should there be some kind of accountability about getting too political if you're a C-level exec in the company, because you can do a lot of damage as well as good, right, with what you say?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to that because from what I do know, and you with your background and your many of your listeners with HR background, when you get to that level, when you're in a publicly traded company and you're dealing with executives, you have extensive vetting and you have extensive employment contracts and expectations.
Yeah.
And so, um, I am willing to say with some confidence that there are no doubt some expectations in those employment contracts
Yeah.
that the individuals in those publicly facing or high profile positions tenor their comments and their actions for the good of the company versus, personal feelings that may be out of alignment with shareholder interest or company strategy.
Yeah, it makes sense. You have a pretty extensive legalese behind all of that with
Mhm.
a lot at stake. So totally get that. Maybe we can switch gears a little bit here to HR, which is our favorite topic, and I mean, for HR people, it's been a rough go. That's all I can say. Since COVID, they were basically therapists to everybody at work. They were dealing with burnout. I mean, every HR person I talked to during COVID was completely burned out, just tired for many reasons. And now we're having layoffs left and right. So they're having to, fire everybody else and then fire themselves. That's what we say
Mhm.
for HR,
Mhm.
right? How are you finding HR executives right now? What's their feelings of things?
They're tired. Yeah, no, they're everybody's tired. I mean, every functional area is tired, but to your point, HR is quite often the implementation piece, get me bodies, get rid of bodies, and help create the culture here. And the challenge also that I'm seeing is in addition to, the influx and then, release of some staff, there is also a greater awareness and willingness to kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier, hold individuals accountable to do the jobs they're being paid to do. So HR is also being tapped to help coach and guide managers on how to elevate the bar and expectations of performance to really maximize return for their investment in individuals instead of just simply having bodies and positions getting things done, if that's making sense. And so I'm spending a lot of time with HR professionals talking with them about work that I'm doing to help them coach internally while I'm an external coach. Um, because, in so many situations, things come and are dropped at the feet of HR that if they had been handled even a little bit differently 3 months before, 6 months before,
Yeah.
the issue that was just dumped on HR's doorstep would not be the monolith that it currently is. It could have been a much easier process and a much less stressful process if they had been clued in and brought in early on. And so, um, I see HR professionals doing somewhat of a better job of positioning themselves to be at the forefront instead of at the end of the directional.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny enough. We've seen a lot of companies now go without HR, and then once there's a legal issue with an employee or something, then they're in a scramble to hire, right? So I totally get the idea of them being, very not very proactive with dealing with issues that can come up, or setting the framework to make sure issues don't even arise, right? This is where you're
Mhm.
proactive with your HR. Where do you see sort of the future of the profession though? Because they're talking about AI replacing a lot of the HR function now, from talent acquisition to compliance,
Mhm.
things like Workday, and then automation that's coming in to do a lot of this. Do you see the strong future for HR in terms of as a profession, or what's sort of your thoughts on that?
Oh, sure, I do. And the examples that you just laid out, it's been happening to the HR function and to many functions for years. I mean,
Yeah.
if you flash back 15 years ago, many organizations, HR was still doing payroll. Well, now if you're still doing payroll internally, something is really wrong. I
Yeah.
mean, there's so many basic programs that can handle your HR or the payroll function for you. But the other transactional aspects of HR, sure, it absolutely makes sense to either automate those, AI, whatever, so that it frees you up to do things that require more amalgamation of your brain. And, John, you and I were kind of talking about this in preparation for our conversation, is when an HR professional can think beyond what their maybe initial transactional activity was. They were a recruiting officer, they were a payroll administrator, or they were benefits, whatever. And they can start looking at how does the work that we do and how do the behaviors of the people that we are helping to bring into this organization and the skill sets they have help this company or hurt this company? And if I can start helping managers identify along the timeline and the path that this employee is with us, various points ahead of the employee hitting those points, where if the manager does something different, they're going to have a better outcome with that employee. And if HR can start thinking more proactively and speaking more proactively about things that matter to managers or should matter to managers, the better off the HR profession is going to be, the HR professional is going to be, and the better off the managers are going to be. Um, and so with that, I think there's a great future for HR professionals if they're willing to stop thinking transactional and start thinking strategically and start thinking about how can I help the people in this company think differently and behave differently to have better outcomes. And that's not a normal way for HR to think quite often.
That makes sense, and I think in the function of too, getting away from the tactics and more to strategy is important for sure, because a lot of this stuff is, well, when you come up in HR, a lot of people, they come up from different paths, right? So those tactical things that, that's why you have your team to do a lot of
Mhm.
that stuff, right? So when you're working with HR executives, how are you helping them to succeed in their new roles, right? I mean, I think that's something we've seen where, at least on my side, when we're recruiting for HR executives, the ones that tend to do the best are the ones that are able to advocate for their programs, understand the business case really well for what they're doing, not just pie in the sky ideas, but real ROI, real metrics, how they affect the business, and being able to speak the language that the CFO understands, the COO understands, the CEO understands in terms of business process, real outcomes, and understanding the business itself and how it operates and how, so giving the business case for things,
Mhm.
speaking in the language that the board typically understands, right? What are your thoughts in terms of how your coaching can help, and what an HR executive should be considering as they look into their next roles?
Well, there's a lot in that statement, John, and I just wanna I wanna
I
say
like funny long,
now
long.
I wanna share something because I completely agree with everything you just said, and when I've shared similar ideas when I speak to a SHRM group or a group of HR professionals, roughly 30% of the room will be going, "Yeah, yeah, I know exactly what she's talking about." And the other 70% are going, "What?" They just when we're talking about the business case for this or talking about the metrics and talking about being influential at the table, it's just not clicking because either they've not had the experience or the training or the exposure. And so before we even get to the C-suite level with HR professionals, I encourage the HR professionals that I interact with at the conferences and things is start more basic. The next time you have a manager who comes to you and she wants to fire John, and you say, "Okay, where's your documentation? Where's the case?" And either they have nothing or they have garbage.
Yeah,
And you say, "Okay, I tell you what, Linda, I understand by what you've said and the little bit that you've got documented here, John is not a good fit for this company. And it's going to make sense for him and us to move him along. Right now, legally, we don't have a very good case for this. And if this tries to move forward, and by the way, I'm going to pull you into any hearing that I have about this so you can be a part of this because we're not going to win this. But if instead you start to document, and here, let me show you how you document. If you start documenting every time you have a conversation because there's a violation here or this directive wasn't followed or whatever, and you start documenting like this in about 3 months minimum, and then you come back to me, and if you got documentation, we can probably make something happen. But until then, I can't help you because legally we don't have a case because you haven't documented enough yet. That right there, coaching a manager how to think about what they're doing, that starts teaching them the business case of what they're doing
yeah,
and the consequences of what they're not doing and doing. So now jump it up to the C-suite. Now, if you've got that kind of grounded foundation in understanding, there are a lot of mechanical pieces that I have to in place, or my managers have to put in place, because if they don't, there are unintended consequences all over. When we're now sitting in the C-suite, you've had experience dealing with managers from all different functional areas of the organization. And you can start listening to their conversations, and you can see John, the CFO, across the table going, "Well, we gotta cut the cost of those benefits because the premiums are gonna go up by 30% next year. And by the way, we're gonna completely take away the maternity, we're gonna completely take away the dental because those are skyrocketing." And you're gonna be the one to sit and go, "Okay, wait a minute, John. I understand the numbers, completely understand the numbers. But let's keep in mind the demographic of our workforce is 65% female, and 59% of them are under 30 years old. And you're going to take away the maternity benefits? I think it's a dumb move on our part. We can find a different way to make those numbers work." That's how you have impact at the C-suite level.
Yeah.
By
No,
not just going, "You
absolutely.
can't do that, you can't do that." You gotta know your demographics, you gotta know your data, and you gotta be able to speak in a language that is gonna make other functional areas around the table go, "Dang, yeah, we gotta talk about this further."
Well, when you put it like that, Liz, I mean, that's exactly what you want them to say, right? When you put it like that,
Yeah,
it sounds reasonable.
yeah,
So, I guess knowing the nomenclature, let's say, would be part of it. Knowing the business case, knowing your data. This is where dashboards are such a big thing. Power BI and so on. I mean, I've worked in those so much. It's definitely something you want to know your dashboards, be able to create dashboards and have the right data at your finger tips to be able to speak to them, right, in meetings.
yeah. But John, it's also it's that, but it's also, if you noticed in that little role play there that I kinda laid out, I didn't go, "Oh my gosh, you know how much work that's gonna be for me and my team to do that, and how many complaints we're gonna get?" I didn't talk about how it's gonna make life hard for me and my team. I talked about the business case
Yeah,
and the reason that this might not be a smart move for you to recommend, because there is a business case to be made here.
yeah.
That's very different. That's very different.
Oh, for sure. I mean, letting um, our emotions, our feelings get involved in these business decisions, it definitely can be detrimental for sure, right? So I think you're right about you know speaking facts and using sort of like the thought process that you're going to see in that for sure as part of how you approach the C levels is
Mhm,
definitely something. We talk about this a little bit in terms of like executive presence, right? And um, when you think about this, it also sort of speaks to the culture of the board, and what kind of composition is of the board, and how are they approaching problems in the past, and things like that to consider. So, if you're in a company that the culture values, make really taking care of their employees, then it's a little easier to get that sort of thing across in terms of maintaining benefits. And others, it's more of we're a 10th percentile employer or something. Then we just cut them anyways, and we expect a high level of attrition anyways every year. So retention's not an issue. So I think it's also comes back to the circle two values as well, right? What kind of
mhm,
values does the company have? Because that affects how these data driven decisions are going to be made at the end of the day, right?
right.
Um,
Mhm,
no, I really appreciate the discussion and really good stuff in terms of, from an ethics standpoint, having someone like yourself who knows how these things play out is really important to discuss, especially in today's climate, right? Where ethics and values sometimes in the companies, they speak to them, but are they really living them? And, um, you know, choosing a company that aligns with you from a values perspective is almost as important as choosing your manager, right? They're
mhm.
both kind of hand in hand. So,
Right. Well, and I'll just add to that, John, it's also, I had a client years ago that we had worked with creating their values, and they had posted them, and then something happened. It was a family-owned business. Something happened with one of the sons, and he completely violated one of the values. And the dad called me 7 o'clock in the morning. He's like, "Liz, what do we do?" And I said, "Well, you just posted the values last week. So either you enforce the values or you don't. And he said to me, you just made this really difficult and really easy at the same time.
Yeah.
And to your point, John, either you're going to be branded a hypocrite, either to your face or the rumbling from your team, and you're going to further demoralize everybody, or you're going to uphold your values and be a person of your word, and people are going to go, didn't think
Yeah.
she'd do it, but she did it. Wow. Good.
That's actually a really
Okay.
good example because it's tough. Sometimes those decisions are hard. And living values is not always easy. That's the thing. It's
Mm-hmm.
one thing to put them up on the board or in a press release, right?
Right.
We went, and I always see it. We went away for a junket for 3 days to Maui. We came back with our values and new logo, right? You've seen that
Mm-hmm.
before. And then it's
Yep.
like, okay, but what are we doing to actually, talk the talk and walk the walk? So,
Yep. Well, that's, and I tell my clients, if you've just created these now, if you can't abide by these yourselves, do not put them up.
yeah,
Don't put them up. Don't share them. Because you got to be willing to stand by these first, and you got to be willing to hold your teams accountable to these. Then put them up. But until then, don't put them up.
yeah. I mean, I guess that also sort of begs the question is, do values change based on what the culture is? Because you're like, okay, you set values, let's say, but aren't they kind of fluid in the sense that, you know, in practice you realize, well, that's not how our team is. And I guess having that alignment of like, how is it the actual culture right now in the office versus what we want it to be? And is it a transformation we have to do to get there? Right? Or is it sort of aspirational only, where we're not even there, but we're just, it's a dream to become these values that we're posting up. Because a
Well,
lot of times there's that change management aspect to this, right?
yeah, well, I think I understood you to say two slightly different things. So
Mhm.
the vision can be aspirational of what we're trying to become.
Yeah,
The values are the behaviors that are needed now and
yeah,
going forward to get us there. And those values can change depending upon the behaviors that are needed, the behaviors that you see that are either helping you move towards your vision or are inhibiting you and holding you back. And so it's can be iterative, but there's two different things. The behaviors are not aspirational, they're expected. Again, I go back to these are the house rules because right now you're getting a paycheck, and that paycheck, by accepting that paycheck, by default, you are agreeing to abide by the values. And I say that firmly because I've done a lot of training with government, and I've had a lot of union reps sit in the back of my room when I do training on values and holding people accountable. And they're like, yeah, she's not saying anything wrong here. Because most of the values, let's be honest, John, they're nothing outrageous. It's simply don't be a jerk when you go to work.
yeah,
It's treat people with respect, do your job, don't steal, share information. They're pretty basic typically. They're not all that hard. Liz Weber, don't be a jerk.
yeah. They're not that hard, but somehow how they not always followed, right? So I mean,
Correct?
I think that's the
Yep.
people factor of business where we're dealing with imperfect people and issues and so on, and we're not dealing with widgets that have a failure rate of 1 in 10,000.
Mm-hmm.
I speak to that in the recruiting side where I'm dealing with an unreliable thing that I'm dealing with, right? Humans.
Mm-hmm.
I can't give the same kind of guarantees as you would with an ISO 10,000 product where it's made to certain specifications. Humans are a very tricky thing, and I guess that's where it's you have your vision, you try to do your best as a leadership team, and you live your values as a team,
Mm-hmm.
um, and you're gonna and also be cognizant of there will be mistakes on the way, there will be issues on the way. It's
Mm-hmm.
never gonna be perfect. You know,
Yeah.
you may show up at a Coldplay concert and have an and I'll leave it at that for today. But no, it was great having you, and appreciate you on the pod.
Thanks, John. It was nice talking with you today.
Thanks.